JBB's Final Thoughts, Episode 44, Jesus Revolution, Truth Seekers, Part 2. Joe Bustillos here. I saw Jesus Revolution, a movie about the beginning of the Jesus movement in the 1970s, Southern California, and having grown up in Southern California in the 1970s, and self-identified back then as a Jesus freak, I thought this should be interesting. If you haven't seen the movie and want my spoiler-free take on the movie, find JBB's Final Thoughts, Episode 43. If you've seen the movie and or just want to interact with my observations based on my own experiences and the movie's portrayal of the Jesus movement, here we go into episode 44 of JBB's Final Thoughts, Jesus Revolution, Truth Seekers Part 2. As I mentioned in Part 1, I commended the makers for not setting up any strawman villains and for not adding something overtly supernatural as pivotal elements to the story. Maybe it's with these biopics where Christian filmmakers have learned to keep the story grounded in their main characters' journeys and not resort to unrealistic characters, plot twists that plague movies like the God Is Not Dead series. In this case, they focused on the two main relationships between Pastor Chuck Smith and the evangelist hippie Lonnie Frisbee, and the beginning of the relationship between high school students Greg and Kathy. One thing that came up when discussing the movie with my friend Deborah, who was also raised in Southern California in the 1960s and 70s, was that she felt like they made the Jesus movement to be way bigger than what she remembered. She remembered seeing a smattering of Jesus freaks on the streets of LA, but there were also just as many Hare Krishnas doing their proselytizing. But it wasn't like all the hippies eventually became Jesus freaks or born-agains. That was an interesting observation that I might not have noticed. I mean, the movie makers began with a scene showing hippies going to a huge open-air concert with Janis Joplin singing and Timothy Leary speaking, and then later in the movie showed a mass baptism at Pirates Cove, which could imply that these movements were of the same size. She was more familiar with the hippies and the concerts and experienced nothing that would suggest that the Jesus movement was comparable in size. My experience was different in that I saw Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa in the early 1980s when they'd gone from the circus tent featured in the movie to a big auditorium, and I remember the Billy Graham rallies at Angel Stadium in Anaheim somewhat later. But obviously, it was possible to be in Southern California in those days and not be aware that any of this was happening. In fact, even though I was there somewhat after the fact, I never knew anything about the Chuck Smith, Lonnie Frisbee story until around 2005. I was attending a tiny Calvary Chapel in Long Beach and playing guitar in the church band when the music leader mentioned Lonnie as this crazy guy blessed by the Holy Spirit who did miracles but was also very controversial. Then I later heard that Lonnie had played a role in the founding of the Vineyard Community Church. Sadly, when it came time for the main founder of the Vineyard, John Wimber, to write his book, Lonnie was written out of the story and only referred to in one passage as the young man. So as I watched the movie, I wondered how much of this part of the story the filmmakers would go into. I was impressed that the filmmakers made Lonnie's insights about how to reach out to the hippies through music and acts of compassion central to the movie. But as the movement grew, there's a scene where Lonnie cries to God in prayer to keep using him, to not leave him. The thing about these kinds of movements is that people do respond in these huge gatherings. But what are they responding to? And more importantly, how do you keep that happening week after week? There were scenes where it was clear that Lonnie felt the pressure and looked like he was crafting his image as the hippie preacher. Whereas at the beginning of the movie, he came off as the sincere seeker of truth who had done it all and experienced it all, and in the end, he found his peace and fulfillment in the message of Jesus. But as things grew, he feared God's power slipping away. I was a biblical studies student at Biola University when my Roman Catholic mom called me after hearing about the Jim Jones massacre, worried that I was headed down that road. That seemed ridiculous, but if I was honest, by that time I had already encountered multiple situations where someone presented themselves as speaking for God. Said prophets probably needed to spend more time talking with a mental health professional to help them with these messages from God. There was one guy, a bit older than the rest of us, who dropped in on our Mission Viejo High School Jesus Freak group during the school day, who presented himself as being even more into Jesus than anyone else and had gathered the interest of a few of the teenage girls. That was a bit cultish, in that it felt like this guy was trying to take control of this natural gathering of believers. Whatever his plans may have been, they were probably thwarted because none of his high schoolers were willing to do anything that might threaten our comfy suburban lives. Then, many years later, I came back to Mission Viejo and heard about the pastor of the local Calvary Chapel being drummed out when some questionable interactions with female church members came to light. My point is that these movements that are dependent on consistent experiential encounters with God also lend themselves to the abuses of leaders who are also looking to keep things going. But for all of the freaks and self-appointed prophets whom I've encountered, there were innumerable sincere believers who found themselves in the leadership roles who were just trying to support their brothers and sisters. You don't hear those stories because they're not controversial. But the danger of authoritarian cultish behavior was definitely something to always stay vigilant against. In the movie, I found the scene of the interview with the Pentecostal leader Catherine Coleman as Frisbee's ministry was peaking interesting, because the filmmakers showed a clear indication of the discomfort of the other characters when Frisbee made the claim to be a prophet. For the uninitiated, the Pentecostal charismatic churches were known for ecstatic shouting and erratic movements, dancing, that were called gifts of the Spirit, while at the other end of the spectrum were the churches with lectures and study sessions from the Bible. The movie presents Chuck Smith's church as being more of the latter, lectures from the Bible, than being open to the charismatic, ecstatic thing. From my own experiences with home Bible studies, I remember that a good part of the beginning of the session was singing, and then the next part was spent studying some part of the Bible, and the remainder spent in prayer for the needs of the people in attendance. In fact, it was at one of these home Bible studies in 1974 where the leader, who was probably only 2 or 3 years older than I, looked straight at me and said that God loved me just the way I was. The group prayed for me, and I've been on this very strange journey ever since. I find it interesting that the movie seems to be okay with the spontaneous stuff in the beginning of the movie, but then used it as a clear indication that Frisbee had lost it when he tries to do the "someone is suffering" call to the congregation later in the movie. Having only attended a couple formal Sunday services at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa back in the day, I don't remember how open they were to the spontaneous stuff. But I'm pretty sure everything was done according to whatever was printed in the church bulletin that they gave you when you came in. In the movie, I found it interesting that they included a quote from Lonnie about how people, like Chuck Smith and later John Wimber, loved how the Spirit worked through him, but were quick to toss him out or toss him aside as a person later on. The filmmakers included enough to make the split between Frisbee and Smith understandable, but then whitewashed things at the end of the movie, just referencing that Chuck Smith and Lonnie later reconciled and that Lonnie died in 1993. This version leaves at least half of the story untold. The other relationship covered in the movie, the relationship between Greg and Kathy, was a wonderful story about a kid living in a trailer on the beach with his alcoholic mom, and the cute blonde living in the big house who invited Greg to a concert, then into drugs, and then to Jesus. Smart, artistic, sensitive Greg was a great everyman to tell the story of that generation looking for truth, rejecting society's restrictions, and trying to find their own meaning. The drug sequences moved the story along. Kathy's sisters aspirated and nearly died, and that scared Kathy straight. Greg was semi-passed out in a van, and the driver of the van nearly got them into an accident, and Craig has to jump out of the van into a rainy highway and runs into Lonnie, and that convinces Greg to get off the path of drugs. My friend Deborah noted that movies still don't know how to convey what it's like to experience LSD. But were they on LSD? The girl choking wouldn't be from LSD or pot. Whatever they were on, the actual point was, drugs are bad. Maybe we were too young, but drugs wasn't a thing with my friends when we became Jesus freaks. For my group of sheltered, naive, suburban kids, the crisis was kissing and making out with one's girlfriend or boyfriend, and how that might conflict with one's newfound Christian faith. Except for Lonnie's references to everyone doing everything when he was in San Francisco, the movie pretty much ignores anything sexual, well, except that Greg thinks that Kathy is cute. The movie definitely focused on dealing with delusioned hippies and uptight Christian fundamentalists, and nothing at all about horny teenagers. This is understandable, given that this movie was produced by a Christian studio interested in promoting the Christian message. All of which brings us back to the part of Lonnie's story that they chose to leave out. For those interested in the part of the story that the Jesus Revolution left out, I found a documentary, Frisbee, The Life and Death of a Hippie Preacher, about his extraordinary role in the Jesus movement and the Calvary Chapel Vineyard Church movements. According to the documentary, after what we saw in the movie, Frisbee came back to Calvary Chapel, less hippie and more associate pastor. But a rift again developed because Frisbee was still drawn to use his spontaneous charismatic gifts and Chuck Smith wasn't. Frisbee then moved on to John Wimber's Vineyard Church that was much more open to the charismatic gifts. This arrangement worked out until Wimber caught wind that Frisbee wasn't able to sufficiently contain his hedonistic side and was indulging in his homosexuality. In the documentary, some reported that Frisbee was known to party on Saturday, but then get up and preach on Sunday. He was fired from the vineyard when he admitted to being homosexual. He did some independent missionary work overseas and continued to try to preach. Sadly, in 1993, he died as a result of an AIDS-related illness. Thus, it was much grimmer than the simple "he died in 1983" title card would convey. I understand that the makers of the Jesus Revolution want to shape their story for their audiences. Just look at the last two movie biographies about rock legends Freddie Mercury and Elton John. The general facts of the story are loosely maintained, but huge things are often glossed over or changed to serve the point of view and allow for their hero to emerge by the final credits. In the case of Lonnie Frisbee, life just wasn't that clean, to be explained away with a reference to reconciliation and death in 1993. There's a part of me that wishes that things were as simple as I thought they were when I was 16 and made my prayer of faith in 1974. I wish that all of my questions could be answered via the verses that I read in The Way, a paraphrased version of the New Testament. I have several friends who still hold to that simple kind of faith. More power to them. I wish that the world was as simple as I thought it was back then. Alas, my time and studies at Loyola Marymount University, Biola University, Fuller Seminary, and various Calvary chapels and vineyard churches, and just interacting with my fellow human beings of every stripe and disposition, has led me to believe that the Jesus Revolution was real, but not necessarily the universal solution to the world's ills that believers would want us to believe. In the documentary, someone mentions that for several years after first meeting Lonnie, all of Chuck Smith's sermons were about love and acceptance. In the movie, they even have him washing the feet of the hippies so they don't dirty the carpeting. But this is also a powerful demonstration of love and acceptance. I felt that as a young person, trying to figure out who I was. There was this tremendous sense of being loved, and that we were all messed up kids needing this love. Unfortunately, like most or many relationships, after feeling such love, most of what I felt was that I didn't measure up and would always be lacking because of my flawed human spirit. While the gospel invites us to love one another, it can be quite difficult to love one another when one finds it hard to love oneself. Here's the sad and tragic part of this whole story, that this gifted messenger, through whom God seemed to be working, over the course of his life probably hated himself because he loved in a way that was forbidden in the Bible, and by those who said that they loved him. Thus, the movie rushes Lonnie off screen and ends the story with how Greg fulfilled Lonnie's prophecy that Greg would preach and bring the gospel to thousands. Somehow the images of the huge harvest festival did not feel like the early Jesus movement gatherings and looked like some televangelist production. But I'm sure the believers were encouraged by this ending. The early parts of the movie, where Chuck Smith let go of the cultural restrictions and let in these dirty strangers, that touched me and reminded me of those days of experiencing the miracle of love and connection to something greater than ourselves. But somehow we lose it for 1,000 different reasons, beginning with our innate tribalism and fears. Somehow we quickly go from, "You're welcome here," to now, "Do these things and don't do these other things." And by the way, nothing you do is of value if it doesn't result in more people becoming part of our specific Christian tribe. I have had some accuse me of being a highly educated fool, as if the problem was that I continued to ask questions and didn't settle for because answers. I'm not about busting anybody's bubble. Like I said, more power to them. But at the same time, when it comes to issues of one's eternal destination, issues where human blood has actually been shed, I'm not going to gloss over some fundamental problems with the gaps between the promise of the gospel and lived human history. All that said, I appreciate some parts of the gospel message, that we need to love and care about and for each other, regardless of what tribe we might call home. that we need to humbly live our lives as part of creation and not claim some kind of ownership, that we need to forgive each other when we fail to live up to our own values, and that we need to value the sacrifices made by our ancestors by trying to live a life of love and respect. One last thing, having rewatched the Frisbee documentary, it feels so dated that the thing that got Frisbee banished was that he admitted to being homosexual. Granted, when I graduated from Biola in 1981, there were students who were unenrolled from the university for going out and dancing, which may well still be school policy. So anything sexual between non-married partners, that's bad enough to toss someone out who has made these movements happen. In the documentary, someone pointed out that maybe God used someone like Frisbee to have a laugh at things biblical literalists think are so important. It would seem that the former cartoonist, Greg Laurie, may be held up as the hero to the story, but without the clown of God, Lonnie Frisbee, there is no story. So until next time, this is Joe Bustillos with JBB's Final Thoughts saying, enjoy, and please subscribe to this podcast where you find it, or the video version on YouTube. Thanks, and amen. Did it right this time.